a sweet and beloved senior.
Margaret liked being out. She liked being around people.
She was very friendly, very outgoing.
Is viciously murdered in her own home.
Oh my Lord, it's her. And I pretty much lost it.
I actually thought I was going to get sick.
To be snuffed out in such a way is just horrific.
Police uncover a trail of suspects.
How would he know that information unless he was in the crime scene?
Having people know how she was found and even what she was wearing is very suspicious.
It just wasn't adding up. He was not being honest and something else was going on.
Before a disturbing discovery.
He was just photographing her in her own home.
Points to a deranged killer nobody saw coming.
I don't think anyone in law enforcement could have had any inkling of the outcome of this case.
This is sick. This is not a normal murder.
This wasn't a horror movie. This was actually happening.
Wadsworth, Ohio, a haven for families just outside Akron.
Wadsworth, a very quiet town. It's very community-oriented.
It's a great family community. It's very common for people not even to lock their doors because there's never a lot of crime that occurs right around in there.
On a Monday morning, April 9th, 2018, the peace is interrupted when police receive a call from a worried citizen.
Wadsworth Police.
Yes, this is Howard Leisure. My aunt lives on Portage Street. A friend of ours stopped over there yesterday to check on her, and she was nowhere to be found.
Okay.
He says papers were on the porch for the last 3 days.
What's her name?
Margaret Douglas.
Initially, the police department was contacted about Margaret being missing from her home.
We don't know where she's at. She's 98 years old.
Does she live there by herself?
She lives there by herself, yes. And she never locks her house.
So our initial response was to look for Margaret to see if she had fallen inside her home and needed help. Patrol officers walked through it, yelling for her to see if she would answer.
We continued to canvass the neighborhood, and we did not locate her.
If her close friends, she's not with them, something's wrong.
We contacted area hospitals and looked in any possible place that she could be.
Margaret was just basically missing.
That evening, Howard and his wife, Cindy, head to Margaret's home to help police with the search.
They asked if we could come down and meet them at the house.
Howard and Cindy started to look for some items common for Margaret to have taken with her when she left. There were specific shoes that she would wear. They were looking for a little red wallet that she carried her money and her credit cards in when she left the home.
So Howard went to look in that front closet.
The clothes had dropped or slipped down that was piled in the top of the closet.
He said, "Oh, I found her shoe." He tried to pull the shoe out.
And I touched it, and it felt cold and clammy.
The shoe was still attached to Margaret, who was in the closet.
And I thought, oh my Lord, it's her. And I pretty much lost it. Something I'll never forget, I'm sorry. But to find her like that.
It was a terrible shock, especially for her nephew, Howard, and I just remember the look on his face.
I actually thought I was going to get sick. I think we were just so appalled and shocked that someone would kill her.
What motive could there be to kill a 98-year-old woman? What could she have done to anybody that would have resulted in that?
Margaret's home is declared a crime scene, and homicide detectives arrive.
Margaret was positioned with her head down in the corner and her backside kind of up in the air. Her underpants were torn inside the closet there. Her nightgown was all unsnapped, and her bra was pulled up. I immediately thought that there was a sexual element to the crime. There was a lot of trauma to Margaret's neck region. Somebody was able to strangle her, and my assumption was manually due to the lack of any ligature marks.
Looking at the condition of Margaret's body, rigor had came and gone. You could look at the different lividity and the pulling of the blood inside the body to see it appeared she had been there for a few days.
As the forensics team gathers DNA and fingerprints, detectives search the house for further evidence.
Her wallet was not located, so that gave us an indication that maybe this was a burglary and they had made off with just the wallet. Margaret didn't always lock her doors, so we weren't surprised when we didn't find forced entry into her home.
Investigators find their first clue outside the home.
I observed a plastic food service glove on the back side of the house and collected the glove just in case that it was involved.
There was not a lot of physical evidence at the crime scene. Besides the glove, the missing wallet was something, but nothing that would direct us in a certain way.
Who would attack and kill a 98-year-old woman in her own home? As they set out for answers, detectives turn to Howard and Cindy to learn more about Margaret.
The best thing to do is to get to know your victim as best you can.
Born in Akron, Ohio in 1919, Margaret was known as a woman of strong character with a fiercely independent streak.
She knew what she wanted, and she wasn't afraid to go after what she wanted to get.
Margaret often told us about her days working at the O'Neills in downtown Akron. She liked being out, she liked being around people.
She was very friendly, very outgoing.
Margaret had very strong opinions, and she was certainly not afraid to tell you what her opinion was.
She was a pretty independent woman, let's put it that way.
After World War II, Margaret married the love of her life, Army veteran Donald Douglas.
If I saw Margaret, I saw Donald, her husband. They were made for each other. They just complemented each other.
The couple moved into the house that Margaret would live in for the rest of her life.
I think Margaret might have lived in that neighborhood close to 70 years.
It was Margaret and Donald's choice not to have any children, and they seemed extremely happy together.
They liked to travel together. They went to ball games. They enjoyed going to the Indians game.
When Donald passed away in the year 2000, Margaret chose to remain in her house, surrounded by friends and caring neighbors.
Margaret was a pretty good friend with the neighbors, David and his wife.
There was another neighbor across the street. Her name was Jan. They just sort of kept an eye on Margaret.
She knew all the kids in the neighborhood, but as she got older, she's got more restricted to the house, and that's when me and my wife stepped in at that point and started taking her shopping and doing things for her as needed.
Margaret loved the fact that she was 98 years old, and she wanted to be 100. She truly loved life.
For someone to have lived such a wonderful, vibrant life, only to be snuffed out in such a way is just horrific. I have a grandmother that's similar in age. It's just very hit close to home.
The investigators were under a tremendous amount of pressure. Every one of them took it very personally, and I think every one of them wanted to find justice very quickly for the family.
At the onset, we had no clue. There was no direction.
Maybe it's financial. Maybe it was a relationship issue. Maybe it was an argument that went too far and something happened that they didn't expect. But at that stage in the investigation, you just don't know.
We need to start somewhere, so we start closest to her.
So that would include looking at Howard and Cindy.
We definitely leave everyone on the list until we can exclusively rule them out and have that be a certainty and not just a feeling.
Coming up, is Margaret's killer hiding in plain sight?
He knew details of where Margaret was found and in what state she was found.
He's come back to the scene of a crime.
Detectives unearth dark secrets.
We found a journal about a desire to kill people.
He was videotaping her while she slept, stalking his victim like an animal stalks its prey.
Leading to a killer no one saw coming.
This is somebody that's ultimately going to be a serial killer if he's not caught.
Police Police are investigating the murder of 98-year-old Margaret Douglas, whose body was discovered stuffed in a closet in her own home.
I just can't imagine a 98-year-old woman being that terrified and not knowing what to do. It's definitely one of the most traumatic things I've ever had to experience in my years with the Wadsworth Police Department.
Detectives begin by interviewing those closest to Margaret, her nephew Howard and his wife Cindy.
We fingerprint and get DNA from Cindy and Howard to show whether their fingerprints or DNA were on something that it should not have been on. We did subpoenas for phone records and also location data, GPS data, so we could tell their whereabouts during the time in question. Cindy and Howard lived approximately 30 or 40-minute drive away, but they would come into town a couple times a month to do her grocery shopping.
She always paid with cash. We swung down, went to the bank, she threw $200 out to go shopping with.
Police ask Howard about Margaret's finances. Was there anyone who stood to gain from her death?
Margaret was really in charge of her own finances. We did look into those accounts and check for activity. We were never able to locate any activity that was out of the normal.
Does she have a power of attorney or a will or anything like that?
No. We've been telling her she needs a will, she needs this. She would never take the time to do it.
There was nobody that we could find that would have any financial gain from her death.
Could Howard or Cindy think of anyone who might wish to harm Margaret?
Any problems with her? Did she want to argue with people or anything like that? Nothing?
No, sweet old lady.
And nobody else, she didn't, have any problems with anybody that... Not that I know of. She was... Margaret often knew. That's why it's so just horrible.
Detectives ask about others in close contact with Margaret. According to Howard and Cindy, the closest is Margaret's former neighbor, David Klinkenbeard.
Cindy and Howard did keep in contact with David, who was Margaret's main caregiver. David would come and check on her a couple of times a week just to see if she was okay and if she needed anything.
David has the most contact with her.
Yeah, he'd go every week, take her trash out, and then he'd take the can back in the next day. So.
After interviewing Howard and Cindy, detectives try to contact David, but he's not answering their calls.
There was some concern not being able to reach David, and that was troubling. We didn't have any other suspects. It made us wonder what was going on.
As detectives try to track David down, patrol officers continue to canvass Margaret's neighbors for information.
During the canvass, we did learn that there had been some vehicles in the neighborhood that had been rifled through, and small items were taken out, like change and things like that.
Is this somebody that was up by Margaret's house and found a crime of opportunity because it's somebody that they can maybe figure out lives alone?
As the canvass continues, officers notice someone watching the activity around Margaret's house.
I noticed a man outside smoking a cigarette, so I went out to make contact with him. This person ended up being David Klinkenbeard. He said that he used to live next door to Margaret. He kind of wanted to know what was going on.
He said he was essentially canvassing the neighborhood looking for anything that was suspicious.
David did strike me as odd at first. It was concerning to me that he was standing out there trying to determine what exactly we had found.
As David continues to talk, police grow increasingly suspicious.
He was kind of making comments about information that seemed strange that he would know about.
He knew details of where Margaret was found and in what state she was found. Having people know how she was found and even what she was wearing is very suspicious. You don't know where someone has gotten their information. Were they there? Were they involved in the murder?
With a growing list of questions about David, officers approach Margaret's neighbors for answers.
One of the neighbors had mentioned how they had seen David driving through the neighborhood, but didn't stop, just kind of drove through. So they thought that was kind of strange. Maybe he's coming back to the scene of a crime, whether he's driving back by because he knows what he did and he's having remorse, or maybe trying to get back inside there to get her body out of there and get rid of it, or to look to see if he left anything behind.
David told some of the neighbors that his fingerprints would be all over the house and he would have to get his fingerprints taken, which is not something that people usually say or think.
The next day, David's appearance in local news coverage of the murder raises further alarm bells.
I turned on the news and there he is on TV, talking to the reporters, putting himself out there.
Was this a guilty man's ploy to hide in plain sight?
That seemed out of sorts to us. Generally, when people are grieving a loss, their instinct is not to cooperate with the media, but David seemed very willing to speak with them.
All of these things added together are possible indicators of someone who is purposely trying to insert themselves in the investigation because they're involved in this investigation.
Could David have possibly been involved in Margaret's murder?
At that point, we had some questions about his actions and his knowledge of how Margaret was found.
He definitely became a main point of interest.
On April 11th, 2 days after finding Margaret's body in her own home, police bring her former neighbor, David Klinkenbeard, in for questioning.
David told us that he last saw Margaret when he was helping her with her trash can on Wednesday.
You didn't come by on Thursday or Friday, not till Sunday?
No, not till Sunday.
On Sunday, he had gone over to the house and he didn't locate her. He had some concerns that maybe she was upstairs in a state of undress and he didn't want to go up there himself. So he contacted Jan across the street.
And that's when you had Jan come over in case she was upstairs and not decent.
Yeah, Jan went up there, she wasn't up there, and then we looked in the closets up there.
Okay, your friend's missing. That'd be the last thing in your mind, whether they're dressed or not. You would go and look for them throughout the entire house, not go get somebody else.
As the interview continues, David's answers only raise further suspicion.
She likes to look nice, and she was a pretty woman.
Yeah.
When she was younger, she was a redhead.
Wow.
Yeah. And she was really, I mean, back then she was really kind of like, not thin then, but, you know, I was surprised how good she looked back then.
Some of the comments that he made about Margaret, in particular her physical appearance when she was younger, she had just been murdered, and here he is describing her figure and her body type in an interview.
The detective asked David about the calls he made when he couldn't find Margaret.
Oh, I want to use my cell phone to call Howard. I got his number on my phone.
Do you have your phone with you?
Yeah.
Would you mind if I had my computer guy just go through and write down the dates of your calls?
I have.
He said he must have left it at home and didn't have it on his person.
It seems strange because, you know, in this day and age, nobody goes anywhere without their cell phone. Their cell phone is always on them.
Investigators must now subpoena David's cell phone records. At the same time, they receive a forensics report from the crime scene.
DNA belonging to Margaret was found on the glove that was discovered outside of Margaret's house.
We believe that the suspect's DNA was on the inside of the glove.
Would you mind if I was able to get a sample of your DNA? We know you're supposed to be in the house. Would that be okay with you?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Detectives send David's DNA to compare against that found inside the glove. While they wait for the results, they check David's cell phone data to verify his alibi.
We were able to go through his day-to-day life and see that he likely was not involved, but there was no concrete evidence that we were able to bring to light.
Unlike the phone records, the DNA findings are conclusive. David is not Margaret's killer.
David ended up being, in the end of all this thing, just a friend of hers that was not involved at all.
Sometimes he would say things that didn't really have an explanation. It just took the time and the effort to understand his involvement, and there was reasonable explanation for all of the things that we had concerns about. He just really cared about Margaret and really had concern that he would have an answer as to what happened.
We had to look at David as probably our #1 interest because obviously his strange comments in the beginning about his DNA and fingerprints, plus he's the one that saw her on a regular basis.
Up until that point where you reach a crossroads, you really do have to look at every tiny detail, every possibility.
Detectives turn their attention to the autopsy report, which paints a terrifying picture of Margaret's last moments.
The medical examiner's report on Margaret showed what kind of force was used to kill her in the end. She had contusions to her head, to her face. She had a fracture to her orbital socket. She had a fracture to her C7 vertebrae in her neck. It showed there was a compression there, which broke her neck.
Margaret was not a frail woman. Not just anyone would be able to manually strangle her.
While the autopsy finds no direct evidence of sexual assault, officers continue to suspect otherwise.
Why would her underwear be ripped off of her? They weren't like pulled off, they were torn.
There were other bodily fluids that were mixed in with the swabs from Margaret's body.
The fact that someone took Margaret in such a horrific manner was a very difficult thing to handle.
As homicide detectives regroup to search for new leads, patrol officers alert them to an unusual crime reported in the early morning hours of April 8th, the day before Margaret's body is discovered.
There was a report of a carjacking very near the scene of Margaret Douglas's home. In a community like Wadsworth, we don't have carjackings. That's not a normal call for us.
They happened in such time close to one another that we had to wonder if they were related.
The carjacking victim is a local man named Paul Shalott.
Paul had reported he was driving along and he happened to notice a 19, 20-year-old man limping, like having trouble walking up the street.
Paul had reported to us that he was just being a good Samaritan and picking somebody up that he thought to be injured.
So as he went out to help him, he said the gentleman just slid into the driver's seat and then locked the doors, wouldn't let him in, and took off with his car.
Officers grow suspicious when they quickly locate Paul's car near the site of the carjacking.
The car was found very quickly, and it was found right there in the same area it was taken.
Literally, like, not even a block away from where he had picked this gentleman up, supposedly, and lost his car.
This happened at a building that had cameras on the outside, so we wanted to kind of investigate Paul's story because it just didn't seem quite right. You could see on the video that Paul had been with what appeared to be a young man. The young man was not limping. He did not seem to be injured in any way.
Paul's initial report did not match anything that video said. It just wasn't adding up. He was not being honest and something else was going on.
Why had Paul lied to police? And who was the young man seen in security footage? Had one of them gone on to do something unthinkable?
We had the carjacking, and then we had Margaret's disappearance. It just started making me think a little bit, could this be the guy that could be involved?
Police investigating the murder of 98-year-old Margaret Douglas have a potential new lead after learning of an alleged carjacking in her quiet neighborhood.
Somebody that's willing to perpetrate a crime such as a carjacking makes you really wonder, is this related to a murder that's just happened a couple blocks away?
But when security video proves the victim, Paul Shalott, has lied to police, detectives demand answers.
When I interviewed Paul to get the whole story, he was very nervous, and then he finally started telling us the truth about how he came to be in that area and what really happened. He was on an app trying to meet somebody, and he did come across somebody. He said he worked for a church, and he didn't want them to find out that he's using a site to try to meet up with young men. He didn't want to admit it right away, but they started getting involved sexually in the car. The male subject he picked up, I guess, started getting upset that things weren't going his way.
The young man that he met up with just kind of snapped and took the car, not what Paul had expected when he met this person online.
With Paul finally being honest, detectives change course and ask if he knows anything about the murder of Margaret Douglas.
He was aware of what had happened and that she was a victim of a homicide. But Paul did not know Margaret at all.
He had no ties to her and real no ties even in that neighborhood. He was just there basically to meet up with somebody that night. Then I started thinking, well, now we need to know who was driving that car, who carjacked him.
Paul was asked for the account information for the app that he used to meet this person on.
He said he couldn't remember the email he used or the password he used to get in there.
Paul was embarrassed about what he had let happen and the fact that he was involved with a young man. He had deleted everything from his phone that was relative to that. We weren't able to recover any of that information.
So we had no way of proving or figuring out who it was that he may have met up with that night.
After hitting another dead lead, frustrated investigators know that public fear is only growing.
There was definitely some fear. There were people that would normally stroll down the street, walk their dogs, let their kids play outside unsupervised, and things like that weren't happening after Margaret's discovery.
And the emotions for everybody were really high and heightened. They're all locking their doors now, and they're really watching for everything. So it was definitely a shock to all of them.
With the community on edge, Margaret's family continues to struggle with their loss.
The hardest part going through all this is the time-consuming and the worrying and waiting for the outcome. And you're not sure what's going to happen.
That was hard. You know, none of us are patient. And we all want to know what happened here, why someone would do this.
The reason you're doing what you're doing is for the victim. You want somebody to be held responsible for what they've done.
Believing that the carjacker may be a serial criminal, police take a closer look at the petty crimes reported around Margaret's neighborhood.
The crimes all took place in just a few block area.
Is there somebody in this neighborhood that's committing a whole bunch of crimes for some reason, because we weren't seeing those crimes spreading out throughout the city like we typically would?
You have to wonder if the person who's committing these petty crimes has escalated to commit something more horrific.
On the night of April 13th, 4 days after the discovery of Margaret's body, police received several calls about two young men.
We had received a lot of different calls where people had seen two male subjects running around, creating mischief, doing things at the park, doing things at the church, and in cars.
A couple of young males were taking some type of device that had wheels on the bottom and hanging out in one of the parking lots.
That same night, police respond to a call that changes everything.
It was reported to us that there had been a break-in to a trailer that was at a construction site.
When officers investigate, they get a huge break.
Someone had left their cell phone behind at the trailer.
Does the phone belong to the person responsible for the neighborhood crime spree, including Margaret's murder? Investigators used forensic software to unlock the phone.
The phone came back to a subject that we had been known in our area for different car break-ins and little thefts from cars that happened in our city and especially over in that area.
He was identified by one of our officers as Zach Thronson. Zach was known to us, and he did have a troubled past. He had been in some more serious trouble, and we were all familiar with him. At this point, we thought that we really needed to bring Zach in and talk to him about what he had been doing that night. Zach was found sleeping in his car at the high school in the parking lot.
As officers bring Zach into the station for an interview, something immediately catches their attention.
Zach had some scratches on his legs, which made me wonder where those came from.
Are they defensive wounds from somebody fighting back against you and scratching you that way? Could they be from something simple, explainable, or evidence into what we were looking into with regards to Margaret Douglas?
Police investigating the murder of Margaret Douglas have connected local teen Zach Thronson to a spate of crimes near her home.
With the carjacking, we know there was supposed to be a young male. Now we have Zach running around, committing these little crimes, all within the same area around the same time frame.
His phone was left behind at the trailer, so we knew for sure that he was involved in the crimes that were all seemingly tied together.
Detectives cut to the chase and ask Zach if he killed Margaret Douglas.
Zach, he owned up for little things he did, but he denied any knowledge of it or being involved at all.
Detectives steer the interview to the identity of the teen seen with Zach in security footage.
He said that he was out with his friend Gavin Ramsey, and that everything that had happened was all Gavin's idea. Gavin had been the one that was trying to break into the trailer, and that he was just standing by and watching it happen, just a presence during the time that Gavin was committing all the other petty crimes. Zach was definitely distancing himself, so there was some concern that he wasn't being honest about everything that they had done.
For the moment, police decide not to charge Zach until they interview his friend, Gavin Ramsey.
Gavin had been in trouble before, and his mom had dealt with that. She was going to hold him accountable for the things he had done. We talked about the trailer, and I just let him know that we knew he was there because Zach had told us that he was there. Property-type crimes and less serious crimes is what we talked about at first.
That's just to see, is he going to own up to that? And then we'd continue from there into something more serious.
You guys didn't take anything? Did you rummage through glove boxes or anything?
Maybe like 50 times, but other than that, seriously nothing.
He admitted to all of them. He would rifle through cars and take things that weren't of a lot of value, just to take things.
Gavin told us during the interview he does it for a rush, so it wasn't about money or anything.
I think the reason that he was so willing to admit to these lesser offenses is to kind of distance himself and clear his name from anything else I might want to talk to him about.
Now, detectives turn their questions to more serious crimes.
We had a carjacking.
Oh my God.
And the suspect is a young white male with a nice complexion and blue eyes. Is that you?
Gavin's demeanor changed substantially when I started to ask him about the carjacking.
Upset you so much. Is there something else you need to tell us?
You've already gotten yourself in trouble, so.
I know, and I don't know that.
Before answering further questions, Gavin asks to speak with a detective alone.
I don't think you two would actually be for a second.
What's that?
You two actually. So I can talk to her. Yeah.
Okay, sure.
So when his mom stepped out,
the carjacking, it was me, I'm gonna be honest about it, but the way that he explained it, that guy, that's not right.
he openly admitted that he was the one who did the carjacking. But he didn't really want to talk about the sexual part of what happened in there.
You guys didn't talk about what kind of sex you were going to have, or...
No, I don't know, it's not something I'm interested in, just the act of him getting the payback, I guess, I don't know, that's, like, it's karma, really. Like, if you're gonna do that, then I'm gonna rob you.
Gavin denies that he was truly interested in meeting up with Paul for any reason other than to catfish him or to teach him a lesson.
This is a kid that's admitting to going around breaking into cars, and it's not for theft, it's for a rush, so we know he's after the adrenaline. What else could he have possibly have done?
With Gavin admitting to the carjacking, the interview turns to questions about Margaret Douglas.
I specifically asked him if he had murdered Margaret, and he denied it.
There's no reason that we would find your DNA inside her house, because we swabbed the hell out of that house.
You shouldn't.
I mean, if you've never been in there, then obviously you wouldn't. But, I mean, you name it. We swabbed it, we took it. I'm sure you know we were there all night.
Yeah.
He was hiding something. There was more to be said. I didn't feel that this avenue had been exhausted with him. This was something that we probably needed to revisit, maybe from another direction.
For now, detectives allow Gavin to leave with his mother.
At this point, we have nothing other than the petty crimes, which are handled through juvenile court, so we wouldn't actually take him into custody to hold him.
But they have one request for Gavin's mother.
I let her know that we had concerns and that I would like to look at his phone. I was expecting to find information about how maybe Gavin was victimized.
Instead, what officers find on Gavin's phone changes everything.
Officer Cooper discovered Google-type searches, murder in Wadsworth, Margaret Douglas investigation, Wadsworth PD reports on homicide investigation.
Then, detectives find something they never would have imagined.
There were actually photos and videos of Margaret Douglas.
Timestamps show that the images were recorded in the early morning hours of Friday, April 6th.
She obviously didn't know he was there, and he was just photographing her from a vantage point in her own home. There was clearly a point in time where she realized that someone was in her home and was startled.
Nothing can prepare investigators for what they see next.
I was absolutely shocked that a child could imagine doing this to another human being. This wasn't a horror movie. This was actually happening.
Detectives investigating the murder of 98-year-old Margaret Douglas have found disturbing evidence on a phone belonging to 17-year-old Gavin Ramsey.
The first thought in my mind was, he knows we're going to discover this. And I could just imagine him fleeing.
Police moved quickly to take Gavin into custody.
Once we picked him up, I briefly told his mom that we had discovered evidence on his phone and that we were going to take him back to the police department. It was definitely not the easiest interview that I had ever done.
I came up on the porch, and I didn't even know what I was going to do. I don't know, I felt like going into the house is like the biggest adrenaline rush I could get. So then I tried the doorknob, and that just happened to be unlocked.
He was videotaping her while she slept, stalking his victim like an animal stalks its prey.
So how long do you think you were in the house before you woke her up?
I don't know, probably like 10, 15 minutes.
You could see in some of the photos the obvious horror on her face as to what was happening.
And then from the time you woke her up to the time you ended up on top of her, how long did that whole part take?
Oh, it's probably like 5 minutes.
He had used both hands to squeeze her neck and push her neck back against the floor, strangling her. He said that once he realized the gravity of what he was doing, it was too late, that she was already gone.
For officers, the most disturbing questions involve what Gavin did after killing Margaret.
When I saw him, it was just like, this is sick. This is not a normal murder.
The sexual nature of his actions was kind of a topic that he was not willing to talk about.
He degraded her by using her for sexual things and videotaping and taking pictures. He'd actually been in there with her for a while.
And then I checked my phone, and it said it was like 4 something, and I knew my mom had to get up at 5 for work.
So he takes the body, finds the closet, because he has to get home. He throws in there to hide her because I don't want anybody to find her. I don't want anybody to know it's me.
But was Margaret simply a random victim of Gavin's need for a rush? Or had he known her better than he'd initially let on?
Gavin lived very close to Margaret Douglas, right around the corner from her house.
Gavin had actually been to her house before, asking her about maybe cutting her grass, raking leaves, or even, shoveling snow. He was out looking for little odd jobs around the neighborhood.
The thought in the back of my mind was that Gavin had observed Margaret regularly and actually thought about the things that he would like to do and that she would make a good victim.
Police arrest Gavin Ramsey for the murder of Margaret Douglas and get a search warrant for his bedroom.
We found gloves matching the same style and type of glove that was found at the scene.
In one of his drawers, I discovered Margaret's red wallet.
Detectives then make an even more disturbing find.
We also found a journal that had some writings about fantasies about murder. He had written almost like a book report on different serial killers. After reading those, there was no doubt in my mind that Gavin would kill again if he had the opportunity. This is something that he enjoys, that he finds pleasure in.
This is somebody that's ultimately going to be a serial killer if he's not caught.
Because of the heinous nature of the crime, the juvenile penal system is not equipped to deal with an individual such as Gavin Ramsey.
Gavin was ultimately charged as an adult with aggravated murder, 2 other counts of murder, burglary, and abuse of a corpse.
We requested that Mr. Ramsey receive the harshest penalty that the law would allow.
Found guilty on all charges, Gavin is sentenced to life in prison without parole for the murder of Margaret Douglas.
When I watched Gavin Ramsey at the sentencing, I still felt in my mind that he doesn't understand the gravity of what he's done. There's still no remorse there.
You would like to think that the world is full of people like you and I, and don't want to think that of such a young person able to act out something that you would only see in a horror movie.
I was shocked to find out that it was a young person who was still in high school that would do something like this.
To murder somebody who's 98 years old, to think you could shove a body in that closet. That part, I just can't even.
It absolutely made me think of my own grandma. I just could not imagine her living such a wonderful life and having it end in such a horrific way.
Despite the horror of Margaret's death, her family honors her memory by thinking of her remarkable life.
Margaret gave you an inspiration that you can still be 98 years old and be very functional, live in your own home, take care of yourself. She, to me, was just an inspiration.
She led a full life and could have been longer.
Margaret would want to be remembered as the person who took care of herself, cared about those around her, and was willing to do what she needed to do.
My aunt was Margaret Douglas, and she was a wonderful woman. She was a great woman.